He thought he was marrying an ugly widow, but when the veil lifted, he was shocked to see a goddess instead. A wealthy CEO, tired of love and emotional baggage, expected a quiet, convenient marriage to a reclusive, grief-stricken woman. But what he gets is a woman with a beauty and strength that shakes him to his core. As they begin their new life, he learns she's not just hiding her face, she's hiding a painful past that could unravel everything. Will love heal their broken lives, or will secrets from her past tear them apart forever? Can this marriage built on grief and secrets become something truly real? Will they overcome the shadows of the past, or is the cost of love too high? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The gentle hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence of Miriam Lawson's modest living room. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the curtained windows, creating patterns on the worn hardwood floor. Miriam sat in her favorite armchair, her fingers absently tracing the edges of a crisp white envelope that lay in her lap. Her eyes drifted to the collection of photographs on the side table, memories frozen in time. One particular image caught her attention, a younger version of herself, radiant and smiling, before the darkness had settled in, before everything had changed. "Has it really been 3 years?" she whispered to the empty room. 3 years since her husband's passing. 3 years of existing rather than living, of wrapping herself in layers of protective darkness. Her hand unconsciously reached up to touch the thick, dark veil that had become her constant companion, a shield between her and the world. The house felt especially quiet today. Her son was at school, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of the decision that lay before her. The letter in her lap represented something she never thought she'd consider again: marriage. Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter once more, though she'd already memorized its contents. The handwriting was precise and businesslike, much like the man who'd written it. Alexander Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Industries, had proposed what he called a mutually beneficial arrangement. The words were carefully chosen, practical rather than romantic, yet they offered something Miriam hadn't dared hope for: stability. She stood up, walking to the window and pulling back the curtain slightly. The neighborhood was peaceful, the same as it had been for the past 3 years. Small houses lined the street, each telling its own story of struggles and dreams. Her house, though modest, had been her sanctuary. But lately it had started to feel more like a prison. "What would you think of this?" she asked aloud, thinking of her late husband. The answer that came to mind wasn't the gentle response one might expect of a grieving widow. Instead, she felt a flutter of rebellion, of hope. Moving to her bedroom, Miriam stood before the full-length mirror that hung on her closet door. The woman who stared back at her was barely visible beneath the dark veil that covered her from head to shoulders. She knew what lay beneath: high cheekbones, warm brown eyes, and skin the color of rich mahogany. But she'd hidden these features away, along with her smile, her joy, her very essence. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, and since then she'd done nothing but think about it. Alexander Montgomery's proposal wasn't born of love or even attraction. He'd never seen her face. It was a business arrangement, pure and simple. He needed a wife to improve his public image, and she needed more than just the memories that haunted this house. Miriam's fingers touched the edge of her veil, and for a moment she considered lifting it. But the habit was too ingrained, the fear too deep. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes, remembering the day she'd first donned the veil. It hadn't been about mourning, not really. It had been about hiding. about making herself invisible to a world that had hurt her too deeply. But is this really living? She asked herself, opening her eyes to look at her veiled reflection again. The loneliness of the past 3 years pressed in around her. She thought of her son, growing up in a house shrouded in sadness. He deserved better. They both did. Taking a deep breath, Miriam reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a long moment before she typed out a simple message to the number Alexander Montgomery had provided. "I accept your proposal." The response came almost immediately. "Excellent. The wedding will be arranged for next week." Next week. The word sent a shock through her system. So soon. But then why wait? This wasn't about love or romance. It was about moving forward, about finding a way out of the darkness she'd wrapped herself in. Standing once more before the mirror, Miriam studied her veiled reflection. The woman beneath the dark fabric was still there, still breathing, still hoping. Perhaps it was time to let her see the light again, even if only a little at a time. "One step at a time," she whispered to herself, smoothing down her dress with trembling hands. The wedding would be small, private. Alexander had made that clear in his letter. No fuss, no ceremonies, just a simple legal proceeding to bind their lives together in what he'd called a mutually beneficial arrangement. Yet as she stood there, preparing herself mentally for the changes to come, Miriam felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not joy, not exactly, but a quiet stirring of possibility. The future stretched out before her, unknown and uncertain, but somehow less daunting than the familiar darkness she'd been living in. The sound of a school bus pulling up outside broke through her reverie. Son would be home soon, and she would need to explain the changes that were coming. But for now, she remained standing before the mirror, her veiled reflection a reminder of who she had been, and, perhaps, a glimpse of who she might become. The veil that had been her protection for so long suddenly felt heavier than usual. Yet she couldn't bring herself to remove it, not yet. That would take time, trust, and a kind of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But maybe, just maybe, this arrangement with Alexander Montgomery would be the first step toward finding that courage. As the afternoon light faded, casting deeper shadows across her room, Miriam remained before the mirror, silently preparing herself for the wedding day that would arrive all too soon. The veil remained in place, but beneath it, something was shifting, awakening. Whether it was hope or fear, she couldn't quite tell. Perhaps it was both. Alexander Montgomery stood at his office window, gazing down at the bustling city 38 floors below. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged beyond his 38 years, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, lines etched around his mouth from too many frowns. He adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, a habit born of a need for control rather than vanity. The marriage contract lay on his mahogany desk, the fresh ink barely dry. Everything was arranged exactly as he'd planned, efficient, logical, and completely devoid of emotional complications. That's how he preferred things now, after Sarah. The memory of his ex-wife's betrayal still burned, even after 5 years. "Mr. Montgomery?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The final wedding arrangements are confirmed for tomorrow." "Thank you, Linda," he replied, his voice steady and businesslike. "Just another transaction," he told himself. "Just another strategic move." He picked up the small folder containing what little information he had about his bride-to-be. Miriam Lawson, widow, 1 child. The background check had revealed nothing concerning, no hidden debts, no questionable associations. She seemed exactly what he needed. Someone quiet, undemanding, who understood that marriage was more about partnership than passion. Alexander had deliberately avoided meeting her in person before the wedding. He didn't want any complications, any chance for emotional entanglement. The photograph in her file showed only a woman in dark clothes, her face obscured by a heavy veil. Perfect, he thought. Someone as guarded as himself. That evening, in his penthouse apartment, Alexander methodically laid out his wedding suit. The ceremony would be small, practical, just like the marriage itself. No flowers, no music, no unnecessary sentimentality. Just a judge, the required witnesses, and the signing of papers. Sleep eluded him that night. He found himself standing on his balcony at 3 a.m, watching the city lights twinkle below. What would Sarah think if she could see him now? She'd probably laugh at how calculated and cold he'd become. But she'd taken his trust and shattered it, leaving him to rebuild himself from the broken pieces. Morning arrived with crisp autumn sunshine. Alexander dressed with his usual precision, checking his reflection one final time. The man in the mirror looked exactly as he should. Successful, controlled, untouchable. His armor was perfectly in place. The courthouse was quiet when he arrived, just as he'd arranged. His lawyer, James, waited at the top of the steps, checking his watch. "Everything's ready," James said, falling into step beside him. "The bride arrived a few minutes ago." Alexander nodded, his steps measured and confident as they walked through the marble hallway. The courtroom they'd reserved was small but dignified, with morning light streaming through tall windows. A handful of people were already seated. His assistant Linda, James's wife, and a young boy who must be Miriam's son. And then she appeared in the doorway. Alexander's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The woman who stepped into the room moved with a grace that caught him off guard. Even through the dark veil, there was something about her presence that commanded attention. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, elegant in its simplicity, and though the veil still covered her face, he could see the proud set of her shoulders, the dignity in her bearing. This was not the broken, plain woman he'd imagined. The judge took his place, and Miriam walked slowly down the aisle. Alexander's heart, so carefully guarded for so long, began to beat an unfamiliar rhythm. He told himself it was just surprise, nothing more. Then came the moment. "The bride may remove her veil," the judge announced. Alexander watched, frozen, as Miriam's hands rose to the dark fabric. Time seemed to slow as she lifted the veil, revealing her face for the first time. His breath caught in his throat. The woman before him was stunning. Her skin was flawless, the color of rich coffee with cream, her cheekbones high and elegant. But it was her eyes that captured him. Deep, expressive pools of warmth and wisdom, touched by sadness but not consumed by it. They held a strength he hadn't expected, a depth that shook him to his core. She was beautiful, not in the shallow, manufactured way his ex-wife had been, but with a natural grace that seemed to radiate from within. The years of grief hadn't diminished her beauty. They'd refined it, given it character and substance. Alexander stood there, completely stunned, all his careful plans and emotional walls suddenly seeming inadequate. He couldn't take his eyes off her face, couldn't process how completely wrong his assumptions had been. The woman before him wasn't just some convenient partner for a business arrangement. She was an enigma, a mystery that called to something deep inside him that he thought had died years ago. His hands, always so steady, trembled slightly as she took her place beside him. The scent of jasmine drifted from her, subtle but intoxicating. Alexander Montgomery, who had planned everything about this day down to the smallest detail, found himself completely unprepared for the reality of Miriam Lawson. In that moment, standing before the judge, he realized with startling clarity that nothing about this arrangement would be as simple as he'd imagined. The emotional walls he'd built so carefully were already beginning to crack, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure whether that terrified or thrilled him. The elevator ride to the honeymoon suite was silent, filled with an electric tension neither of them quite knew how to address. Alexander stood with his hands clasped behind his back, stealing glances at Miriam when he thought she wasn't looking. The veil was gone now, tucked away in her small clutch, and he found himself captivated by the way the overhead lights played across her features. When they reached the top floor of the luxury hotel, Alexander led the way down the plush carpeted hallway, key card in hand. He could hear the soft click of Miriam's heels behind him, measured and hesitant. At the door to the suite, he paused, suddenly uncertain of the proper protocol for this unconventional situation. "Allow me," he said, opening the door and holding it for her. Miriam gave him a small nod as she passed, the scent of jasmine following in her wake. The suite was exactly as Alexander had specified, elegant but not overly romantic. Fresh flowers adorned the tables, their subtle fragrance filling the air. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city skyline, now bathed in the warm colors of late afternoon. "Would you like something to drink?" Alexander asked, moving toward the wet bar. "There's champagne, of course, but also mineral water. Juice?" "Water would be fine, thank you," Miriam replied softly, standing near the windows. Her fingers traced patterns on the glass as she gazed out at the city below. Alexander brought her the water, then poured himself a scotch. He needed something stronger to steady his nerves. This wasn't going according to plan. He'd expected to feel in control, detached even, but instead found himself increasingly drawn to this mysterious woman who was now his wife. "The view is beautiful," Miriam said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but clear, with a musical quality that made Alexander want to hear more. "Yes, it is." He wasn't looking at the view. Miriam turned from the window, catching his gaze. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "This isn't what you expected, is it?" Alexander took a sip of his scotch before answering. "No," he admitted. "I confess I had different expectations. Because of the veil." There was a hint of something in her voice, not quite bitterness, but perhaps resignation. "Partly," he said. "I assumed." He trailed off, realizing how his assumptions might sound. "You assumed I was hiding something?" Miriam moved to sit in one of the plush armchairs, smoothing her cream-colored dress. "I suppose, in a way, I was." Alexander sat across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Would you tell me why?" Miriam's fingers tightened around her water glass. For a long moment, she was quiet, and Alexander thought she might not answer. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "After James, my late husband, died, the veil became my shield. It was easier to hide behind it than to face the world." She paused, taking a careful sip of water. "People expect certain things from a widow. They expect grief, tears, vulnerability. The veil gave me privacy when I needed it most." Alexander leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the pain beneath her composed exterior. "And before he died?" A shadow passed across Miriam's face. "James was complicated. He came from a wealthy family, had certain expectations about how a wife should behave, look, speak." Her hand unconsciously touched her neck, as if remembering something. He could be very critical when those expectations weren't met. The implications of her words made Alexander's jaw tighten. "He hurt you?" "Not always physically," Miriam said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Words can leave deeper scars sometimes. He had a way of making me feel less than, inadequate. The veil became a way to hide my supposed imperfections, even after he was gone. Alexander set his glass down harder than he intended, making Miriam jump slightly. "I apologize," he said quickly. "I just find it difficult to understand how anyone could make you feel inadequate." A sad smile touched Miriam's lips. "You've known me for less than a day, Alexander. You don't really know me at all." "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but I'm beginning to realize that this arrangement might be more complex than I anticipated." "Are you having second thoughts?" There was a vulnerability in her question that tugged at something in Alexander's chest. "No," he said firmly, "but I think we both need to adjust our expectations." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the room. A knock at the door announced the arrival of their dinner, which Alexander had arranged to be served in the suite. As the hotel staff set up the meal on the private dining table, both Alexander and Miriam welcomed the brief interruption, using the time to gather their thoughts. Once they were alone again, seated across from each other at the elegantly set table, Alexander found himself studying Miriam's face in the soft lighting. The sadness he'd glimpsed earlier was still there, but there was something else too, a resilience, a quiet strength that impressed him. "I hope you like Italian cuisine," he said, gesturing to the carefully prepared dishes before them. "I do," Miriam replied, offering him a small but genuine smile. "Though I must admit I haven't dined like this in quite some time." They ate in companionable silence for a while, both aware of the strange intimacy of sharing a meal with someone who was both stranger and spouse. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the table, and something unspoken would pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were both navigating unfamiliar waters. "Tell me about your son," Alexander said as they neared the end of their meal. He'd noticed how Miriam's expression had softened when the boy had hugged her after the ceremony. For the first time that evening, Miriam's face truly lit up. "David he's my anchor. He's 10 years old, but sometimes I think he has an old soul. He sees things so clearly, in a way that adults often miss. He seems like a remarkable child." "He is." Miriam toyed with her napkin. "He's been so strong through everything. Sometimes I worry that he's had to be strong for too long." Alexander found himself wanting to reach across the table and take her hand, but he resisted the impulse. Instead, he said, "Perhaps this arrangement can provide some stability for both of you." "Perhaps," Miriam agreed softly. "Though I hope you understand, Alexander, David has to be my priority." "Of course," he said immediately. "I wouldn't expect anything else." They looked at each other then, really looked, and Alexander felt something shift between them. It wasn't attraction exactly, though that was certainly present. It was more like recognition. Two wounded people beginning to see past each other's carefully constructed facades. As they finished their meal, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, simple things that helped ease the tension. Yet beneath the surface, both were acutely aware that this marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, was already evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, and in their reflection, Alexander caught glimpses of Miriam's profile as she spoke. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her quiet strength that intrigued him most. He'd thought he was preparing for a simple business arrangement, but instead found himself facing something far more complicated, a woman whose pain and resilience challenged his own carefully maintained emotional distance. The morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Miriam stood in the spacious kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching the city come alive below. It had been 3 days since their wedding, and the reality of their arrangement was slowly settling in. Alexander entered the kitchen, his suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor controlled as always. But Miriam noticed the slight hesitation in his steps when he saw her, a tiny crack in his usual confident facade. "Good morning," he said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Did you sleep well? As well as can be expected in a new place," Miriam replied softly. She watched as he prepared his coffee with precise movements. "David called earlier. He's settling in well with my sister." Alexander nodded, his expression softening at the mention of her son. "That's good to hear. We can arrange for him to visit this weekend if you'd like." Miriam's face brightened momentarily, then clouded over. "I'd like that. But are you sure it won't interfere with your schedule?" "My schedule can be adjusted," Alexander said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. He had noticed how Miriam seemed to shrink whenever she made requests, as if expecting rejection. It stirred something protective in him. Later that afternoon, Miriam found herself in the building's rooftop garden. She hadn't expected such a peaceful space in the heart of the city. Her fingers traced the petals of a blooming rose, remembering how she used to tend her own small garden. Before, "I didn't know anyone used this space." Alexander's voice startled her from her thoughts. He had loosened his tie, and his jacket was missing. Small signs of the man beneath the CEO exterior. "It's beautiful up here," Miriam said, gesturing to the flowers around them. "Sometimes we forget to look for beauty in unexpected places." Alexander moved closer, studying a cluster of wildflowers. "I've owned this building for 5 years, and I've never really noticed these." "That's because you're always rushing," Miriam said, then bit her lip, worried she'd overstepped. But Alexander surprised her with a small chuckle. "You're probably right," he admitted. "I've always believed time was money." "And now?" Miriam asked, curious despite herself. "Now, I'm learning there might be more to life than quarterly reports." His eyes met hers, and for a moment the walls between them seemed thinner. The days fell into a routine. Alexander would leave early for work, but he made a point to have breakfast with Miriam first. She, in turn, began sharing small parts of herself. Her love for photography, her dreams of writing children's books, passions she'd buried during her first marriage. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Alexander noticed Miriam looking through a leather-bound portfolio. "What's that?" he asked, settling into the armchair across from her. Miriam hesitated before turning the portfolio toward him. Inside were photographs, stunning black and white images of city life, nature, and people caught in unguarded moments. "I used to do freelance photography," she explained, "before I got married the first time." Alexander leaned forward, genuinely impressed. "These are extraordinary, Miriam. Why did you stop?" The shadow that crossed her face told him the answer before she spoke. My first husband, he said it was a waste of time, that I needed to focus on being a proper wife." Alexander's jaw tightened. "He was wrong," he said firmly. "You have real talent." Tears glistened in Miriam's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found himself looking forward to coming home. Miriam had a way of making the penthouse feel less like a showpiece and more like a home. She'd added small touches, fresh flowers, comfortable throws, the smell of home-cooked meals. But more than that, she'd brought a presence that made him aware of how empty his life had been. One night, they stood together on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I never used to watch sunsets," Alexander admitted, "always too busy with the next meeting, the next deal." Miriam smiled, but her eyes held a distant look. "Life has a way of teaching us to slow down, sometimes through the hardest lessons." She wrapped her arms around herself, and Alexander noticed she did this often when memories surfaced. "Would you tell me about him?" Alexander asked quietly. "Only if you want to." Miriam was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He was charming at first. Everyone thought we were perfect together. But behind closed doors—" She took a shaky breath. "He had a way of making me doubt everything about myself. My looks, my talents, my worth as a person. By the end, I barely recognized myself." Alexander's hands gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles white. The protective feeling he'd been experiencing grew stronger. "And after he died, I was lost for a long time," Miriam admitted. "If it hadn't been for David—" She shook her head, but the hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment again. "Is that why you agreed to this arrangement?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. Miriam turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. Partly, it felt safer than trying to fall in love again. She paused. "Why did you?" Now it was Alexander's turn to look away. "My first marriage taught me that love was unreliable. Business deals made sense. They had clear terms, clear expectations." He laughed humorlessly. "I thought this would be simpler." "And now?" Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. But the moment was interrupted by the ringing of Alexander's phone, another business emergency requiring his attention. As he turned to leave, Miriam remained on the balcony, her silhouette framed by the last rays of sunlight. Alexander paused at the doorway, struck by how much he wanted to stay, to continue their conversation. But the walls they'd built around their hearts were still too high, the memories of past hurts too fresh. "I'll try not to be too late," he said instead. Miriam nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I understand. Business calls." As Alexander walked away, he realized that for the first time in years, he wished it didn't. The autumn evening wrapped around them like a soft blanket as they sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the east floor-to-ceiling windows. Miriam curled up on the sofa, a cup of tea warming her hands, while Alexander sat in his favorite leather chair, his usual business attire replaced by casual clothes that made him look younger, more approachable. "I never thought I'd marry again," Alexander said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice carried a weight that made Miriam look up from her tea. "After Catherine, I mean." Miriam set her cup down carefully, sensing the importance of this moment. "Your first wife?" Alexander nodded, his fingers absently tracing the arm of his chair. "We met in college. She was brilliant, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted." He paused, and Miriam could see the old pain flickering across his face. "We built the company together, actually, or at least that's what I thought we were doing." "What happened?" Miriam asked softly. She was embezzling funds, had been for years. His laugh was hollow. "I was so focused on growing the business, I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. She nearly destroyed everything we'd built." Miriam's heart ached at the raw hurt in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Alexander." "The worst part wasn't the betrayal," he continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "It was realizing that while I'd been falling more in love with her every day, planning our future, she'd been plotting her exit strategy. Everything had been a lie." Miriam moved without thinking, crossing the room to sit on the ottoman near his chair. "That must have been devastating." "It changed me," Alexander admitted. "Made me build walls, made me stop trusting." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Until now. The vulnerability in his eyes made Miriam's breath catch. She understood walls, had built plenty of her own after James died. I know what you mean. After James. She swallowed hard. Sometimes the scars we can't see take the longest to heal. Alexander leaned forward, his hand hovering near hers before gently covering it. The warmth of his touch sent a small shiver through her. Tell me about your scars, Miriam. And suddenly she wanted to. The words came tumbling out, things she'd never told anyone. James was complicated. He could be so charming in public, but behind closed doors. She took a shaky breath. He had a way of making everything my fault. If dinner wasn't perfect, if I spoke too much at parties, if I wanted to pursue my photography. Alexander's hand tightened on hers. He tried to dim your light. Tears pricked at Miriam's eyes. Yes, and the worst part is I let him. I became smaller and smaller until I barely recognized myself. But you survived, Alexander said softly. You're here, raising your son, building a new life. Before Miriam could respond, the doorbell rang, shattering the intimate moment. Alexander moved to answer it, but Miriam froze when she heard the familiar voices in the foyer. Where is she? Where's Miriam? Margaret Preston's commanding tone sent ice through Miriam's veins. James's mother swept into the living room, followed by his brother Robert, their expensive clothes and imperious expressions exactly as Miriam remembered them. Miriam, Margaret said, her smile not reaching her eyes. We've been looking everywhere for you. Alexander moved protectively to Miriam's side. I'm Alexander Montgomery, Miriam's husband. To what do we owe this unexpected visit? Robert stepped forward, all business. Family matters, Mr. Montgomery. The reading of James's will has revealed some complications. Miriam's presence is required at the estate. The estate? Miriam's voice came out barely above a whisper. I thought everything was settled years ago. Margaret's laugh was sharp. Hardly. You have obligations, Miriam. To the family, to James's memory. You can't hide away forever. She's not hiding, Alexander said firmly. And any discussions about the estate can be handled through proper legal channels. This isn't just about legal matters, Margaret snapped. This is about family, about tradition, about Miriam taking her rightful place. My rightful place. Miriam interrupted, finding her voice. The same place where I was belittled and controlled for years. Robert's expression hardened. Now, Miriam, let's not be dramatic. We're here to help you claim what's yours. What's mine? Miriam stood, trembling but determined. Everything I had in that house was taken from me. My confidence, my self-worth, my dreams. I don't want anything from the estate. You don't have a choice, Margaret said coldly. The terms of the will are clear. Either you take your place in managing the estate, or certain arrangements regarding your son's future could become complicated. The threat, though veiled, was clear. Miriam felt her knees weaken, but Alexander's steady presence beside her gave her strength. I think it's time for you to leave, Alexander said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Any further communication can go through our lawyers. After they'd gone, Miriam sank onto the sofa, shaking. Alexander sat beside her, close but not touching, respecting her need for space. I can help you with this, he said quietly. My legal team? No. Miriam interrupted, then softened her tone. I mean, thank you, but I need to handle this myself. I just don't know how. Alexander was silent for a moment. Let me help you find the right lawyers, at least. You don't have to face them alone anymore. Miriam looked at him, seeing not just the successful businessman or her arranged husband, but someone who understood what it meant to be betrayed by family. The offer of help made her uncomfortable. She'd grown used to handling things on her own, but something had shifted between them tonight. For the first time, she felt like they were truly partners. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." The legal documents arrived 3 days later, a thick manila envelope that felt like lead in Miriam's hands. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the Preston family's law firm letterhead, while Alexander made coffee behind her. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, but Miriam felt cold. "You don't have to open it right now," Alexander said, placing a steaming mug beside her. Miriam shook her head. "No, I need to know what they're demanding." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. As she read, her face grew paler. Alexander watched her with concern. "What is it?" "They're claiming I'm in breach of the estate terms," Miriam said, her voice hollow. "According to this, James left specific instructions about my role in managing the family's charitable foundation. If I don't comply—" She swallowed hard. "They're threatening to contest my custody arrangement." Alexander's jaw tightened. "They can't do that. You're his mother. The Prestons have money, influence. They've always gotten their way." Miriam pushed the papers away, her coffee untouched. "Maybe I should just give them what they want." "No." Alexander's voice was firm. "I've dealt with people like this before. They're using intimidation tactics because they think you're vulnerable." He pulled out his phone. "Let me call my legal team. We can have a counter-strategy by this afternoon." But Miriam felt a familiar heaviness settling in her chest. "Alexander, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is what I'm good at," he interrupted, already scrolling through his contacts. "Trust me, I can handle this." Those words, "I can handle this," echoed in Miriam's mind, reminding her of all the times James had said similar things, right before making decisions that left her feeling powerless. She stood up abruptly. "I need some air," she said, leaving Alexander mid-dial. In the garden, Miriam found her son playing with his toys under the old oak tree. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wise beyond his years. "Are you okay, Mama?" Miriam forced a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart." She sat beside him on the grass, watching as he arranged his action figures in careful formations. "Is it about Grandma Preston?" he asked quietly. Miriam's heart clenched. "How did you know?" "I heard her the other day. She sounded angry, like she used to get at the old house." Miriam pulled him close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Are we going to have to go back there?" "No, baby, never." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. The Prestons had always viewed her as an outsider, someone who'd married beneath their social status. Now they were using their power to force her back into their world. Inside, she could hear Alexander on the phone, his voice carrying through the open window as he spoke with his lawyers. He was in his element, discussing legal precedents and strategic responses. Part of her was grateful for his help, but another part felt suffocated by the way he'd taken charge. Later that evening, after putting her son to bed, Miriam found Alexander in his home office, surrounded by legal papers. He looked up with a triumphant smile. "Good news. My team thinks we have a solid case for harassment. We can file a restraining order against the Prestons and—" "Alexander," Miriam interrupted softly. "Please stop." He blinked, confused. "Stop what? I'm trying to help." "I know you are." Miriam sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "But this isn't just about legal strategies. This is my life, my history with these people. Every time I think I've moved past it, something pulls me back." Alexander set down his pen, really looking at her for the first time that day. "Talk to me, Miriam. Help me understand." "When I married James, I thought I was joining a family. Instead, I found myself in a gilded cage. The Prestons have this way of making everything seem proper and civilized on the surface, while slowly crushing you underneath. She wrapped her arms around herself. The foundation they want me to manage? It was my idea originally. I wanted to help underprivileged children access art education, but they took it over, turned it into another tool for their social climbing. All the more reason to fight them, Alexander insisted. We can expose their manipulation. We. Miriam stood up, pacing the room. Alexander, I know you mean well, but you're doing exactly what they always did, making decisions about my life without really asking what I want. The hurt that flashed across his face made her regret her words immediately, but she couldn't take them back. The truth was, she'd been feeling increasingly trapped between her past and present, between the Prestons' demands and Alexander's well-intentioned but overwhelming involvement. What do you want, then? Alexander asked quietly. Miriam stopped by the window, looking out at the darkened garden where her son had played earlier. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to fight, to finally stand up to them. But another part... She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Another part just wants to let it all go. Start completely fresh, without their money or their influence hanging over me. You'd be giving up your rights, your inheritance. Maybe that's the price of freedom. Miriam turned to face him. I need time, Alexander. Time to think, to figure out what I really want. Not what the Prestons want, not what you think is best, just me. Alexander stood, taking a step toward her, but Miriam backed away slightly. The hurt in his eyes deepened, but he nodded. I'll tell the lawyers to hold off on any actions for now, he said formally. Thank you. Miriam headed for the door, then paused. I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. I need some space. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed later, Miriam could feel the walls she'd carefully built around her heart growing higher. The Prestons' attempt to reclaim control over her life had awakened old fears, old patterns of withdrawal. And Alexander's passionate but overwhelming response had only complicated things further. She thought of her son, sleeping peacefully down the hall, unaware of the battles being fought around him. She thought of the foundation that had once represented her dreams of making a difference. She thought of Alexander, probably still in his office, trying to protect her in the only way he knew how. But mostly she thought about herself, the woman who had survived James's emotional abuse, who had rebuilt a life for herself and her son, who had taken a chance on marriage again. Now, faced with the ghosts of her past and the uncertainties of her present, she felt that careful reconstruction beginning to crumble. The moonlight cast shadows on the wall, and Miriam watched them dance, feeling more alone than she had in months. The marriage that had seemed like a path to stability was becoming increasingly complicated, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to navigate these turbulent waters while fighting the Prestons' legal assault. Tomorrow she would have to face it all again. The lawyers, the demands, Alexander's well-meaning but overwhelming support. But tonight, in the quiet of the guest room, she allowed herself to retreat into the familiar comfort of emotional distance, where neither the Prestons' threats nor Alexander's intensity could reach her. The morning sun cast long shadows across Alexander Montgomery's desk as he stared at the stack of legal documents before him. His fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the polished mahogany, a habit he'd developed over years of dealing with difficult business situations. But this wasn't business. This was personal, and that made it infinitely more complicated. Across the room, Miriam sat quietly in an oversized armchair, her face turned toward the window. The distance between them felt like miles, though it was merely feet. The silence that had settled between them over the past few days was heavy, filled with unspoken words and growing frustration. The lawyers need your signature on these papers by Friday, Alexander said, his voice clipped and professional. They can't proceed without your authorization." Miriam's shoulders tensed visibly. "I told you I needed time." "Time isn't a luxury we have right now. The Prestons are pushing forward with their claim. Every day we delay gives them more ammunition." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and resignation. "Is that all you see? A battle to be won?" Alexander pushed back from his desk, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I see millions of dollars that rightfully belong to you. I see a foundation that could do real good in the world. I see people trying to take advantage of you, and I don't understand why you're letting them." "You don't understand a lot of things," Miriam said softly, rising from her chair. She moved toward the door, her steps measured and careful, as if walking on broken glass. "Then help me. Understand." Alexander's voice rose slightly, his composure cracking. "I'm trying to help you, but you keep pushing me away." Miriam paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. "Maybe that's because every time you try to help, it feels like you're trying to fix me. Like I'm another problem for you to solve." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He watched her leave, the soft click of the door closing echoing in the sudden silence. His mind went back to their wedding day, to the moment she'd lifted her veil, and he'd seen something rare and precious in her eyes. Now that light seemed to be dimming, and he didn't know how to stop it. Days passed, and the gap between them widened. Alexander threw himself into work, spending long hours at the office, telling himself he was giving Miriam the space she needed. In reality, he was retreating to familiar territory, where emotions could be filed away and problems had clear solutions. Miriam, too, withdrew into herself. She spent more time in the garden with her son, finding solace in his innocent questions and unconditional love. The boy noticed the tension between the adults, though he didn't fully understand it. One evening, as Miriam tucked him into bed, he asked, "Is Alexander going away like Daddy did?" The question shattered something inside her. That night, after her son had fallen asleep, Miriam found herself standing in the doorway of Alexander's home office, where he was still working despite the late hour. The sight of him, illuminated by his desk lamp, brought back memories of their early days together, when hope had seemed possible. "He asked if you were leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked up, startled by her presence and her words. "What?" "My son. He wanted to know if you were going away like his father did." Miriam's voice cracked, and suddenly the tears she'd been holding back for days began to fall. "And I didn't know what to tell him because I don't know myself anymore." Alexander rose from his desk, but stopped short of approaching her, uncertain of his welcome. "Miriam, I keep waiting for it to happen," she continued, wrapping her arms around herself. "For you to realize I'm too broken, too difficult. That's what James always said, that I was impossible to love, that I made everything harder than it needed to be." Her breath hitched. "And now I'm doing it again, aren't I? You're trying to help, and I'm pushing you away because I'm so scared of being hurt again that I'd rather hurt myself first." The raw honesty in her words broke through Alexander's own defensive walls. He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded bird. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "But I've been handling this all wrong. I thought if I could just fix the legal issues, everything else would fall into place. I didn't realize I was making you feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood." Miriam looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. "I don't know if I can fight them, Alexander. Every time I think about facing the Prestons, about diving back into that world of manipulation and control, I feel like I'm drowning. But I don't know how to explain that without sounding weak." "You're not weak," Alexander said firmly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And if you don't want to fight this battle, we won't. The money, the foundation, none of it matters if it's hurting you." His words seemed to release something in Miriam, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Alexander reached out instinctively to steady her, and this time she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her tears soaking into his shirt as years of pent-up fear and pain poured out. As he held her, Alexander felt his own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. He'd been approaching their marriage like a business merger, trying to protect his heart while still maintaining control. But standing there in his darkened office, with Miriam finally letting him see her complete vulnerability, he realized how much he'd been hiding from his own emotions. Later that night, as Miriam slept fitfully in their bed for the first time in days, Alexander sat in his office, staring at the legal documents that had caused so much strife. He thought about his role in their marriage, about how his need for control and his fear of emotional involvement had contributed to their recent struggles. He needed to step back, to reevaluate his approach not just to the legal battle, but to their relationship as a whole. Miriam didn't need a protector or a problem solver. She needed a partner who could understand and support her without trying to fix everything. The realization was both humbling and frightening. Alexander had built his life around being the man with all the answers, the one who could solve any problem through determination and strategic thinking. Now, faced with the complexity of love and healing, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about relationships and trust. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Miriam sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal papers before her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the latest document from the Prestons, another demand letter filled with thinly veiled threats and manipulative language. She could almost hear her late mother-in-law's voice in every carefully crafted sentence. Her son's footsteps padded down the hallway, and she quickly tucked the papers away. He didn't need to see her anxiety. Not again. As he entered the kitchen, his sleepy eyes brightened at the sight of pancakes waiting on the counter. "Mom, these smell amazing," he said, climbing onto his chair. Watching him eat, Miriam felt a surge of protective love wash over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every decision she made would affect him too. The Prestons' constant interference in their lives had to stop. Not just for her peace of mind, but for his future. Alexander appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work but looking unusually hesitant. Their conversation from the previous night hung between them like a delicate thread, neither quite sure how to proceed. "Good morning," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with an openness she hadn't seen before. After their son left for school, Miriam pulled out the papers again. Alexander sat beside her, not reaching for them as he usually would, but simply waiting. "I need to face them," she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. "Not because of the money or the foundation, but because I need to show them, and myself, that I'm not that scared, broken woman anymore." Alexander nodded slowly. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. Not as your lawyer or your protector, but as your husband. I realize now that I've been approaching this all wrong." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry, Miriam. I got so caught up in trying to fix everything that I forgot to just listen, to understand what you really needed." Tears welled in Miriam's eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed the night before. These felt cleansing, like rain after a long drought. "I want to tell you about James," she said quietly. "About what it was really like, living with the Prestons' expectations, their judgment, their constant criticism. I need you to understand why this is so hard for me." And so she told him everything, about the subtle manipulation, the way they'd isolated her from her friends and family, how they'd used their wealth and influence to control every aspect of her life. She spoke about James's mood swings, his family's enablement of his behavior, and how they'd blamed her for his death. Alexander listened without interrupting, his hand steady in hers. When she finished, he took a deep breath. "I've been treating this like a business negotiation when it's really about healing, about reclaiming your power from people who never had the right to take it in the first place." Miriam squeezed his hand. "I need to do this my way, not with aggressive lawyers or business tactics, but with dignity and truth. They need to see that I'm not fighting for money. I'm fighting for my self-respect." "Then that's how we'll handle it." Alexander agreed. "You take the lead, and I'll be right beside you, supporting whatever decisions you make." Over the next few hours, they worked together to draft a letter to the Prestons. Not a legal response, but a personal one. Miriam's words flowed onto the page, years of unspoken truth finally finding their voice. She wrote about her love for James despite his flaws, about her right to honor his memory while still moving forward with her life, and about her determination to create a healthy future for their son. As she wrote, Alexander watched the transformation happening before his eyes. The woman who had hidden behind veils was emerging stronger and more beautiful than ever, not because she was leaving her past behind, but because she was finally facing it on her own terms. When the letter was finished, Miriam sat back, emotionally drained but peaceful. "Thank you," she said, looking at Alexander. "Not for fixing things, but for being here while I figure out how to fix them myself." Alexander moved his chair closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm learning too," he admitted. "Learning that love isn't about solving problems or protecting someone from pain. It's about walking through the pain together, trusting each other enough to be vulnerable." The word love hung in the air between them, unexpected but not unwelcome. Miriam leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "Not just of the Prestons, but of letting myself trust again, of believing that someone could accept me with all my complications and scars." "I'm not perfect," Alexander said softly. "I've made mistakes, gotten things wrong, but I want to get them right. With you, with us, I want to build something real, something that goes beyond our original arrangement." Miriam lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "I think we already have," she said. "We just needed to admit it to ourselves." They sat together in the quiet kitchen, the morning sun painting patterns on the wall, both understanding that while the battle with the Prestons wasn't over, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The walls they'd built to protect themselves were finally beginning to crumble, revealing the possibility of a love neither had expected to find. Later that evening, Miriam and Alexander sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the garden, and for the first time in weeks, they both felt at peace. "Tell me about your childhood dreams," Alexander said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Before life got complicated, what did little Miriam want to be?" A smile tugged at Miriam's lips. "I wanted to be an artist. I used to spend hours drawing in my notebooks, flowers, faces, anything that caught my eye." She paused, running her fingers along the arm of her chair. "I actually went to art school for a year before I met James." Alexander turned to face her, genuine interest lighting up his features. "I had no idea. Do you still draw?" "No," she admitted, her voice growing quiet. "James, he didn't think it was practical. His family agreed. They said I needed to focus on being a proper wife." Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. Would you like to start again? We could convert one of the spare rooms into a studio." Miriam's eyes widened with surprise, then softened with emotion. "You'd do that?" "Of course," he said, reaching for her hand. "This is your home too, Miriam. You should be able to pursue what makes you happy." Their moment of connection was interrupted by the sharp ring of Alexander's phone. His expression darkened as he read the message. "What is it?" Miriam asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. "The Prestons," he said, his voice tight. "They're claiming they have evidence that James was planning to divorce you before his death. They're trying to use it to challenge your right to the inheritance." Miriam felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. James never—" "It's a lie," Alexander assured her firmly. "They're getting desperate, resorting to dirty tactics." Miriam stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe we should just give up. Let them have what they want. I'm so tired of fighting." Alexander rose and stepped closer to her, but didn't touch her, recognizing her need for space. "This isn't just about the inheritance anymore, Miriam. It's about standing up to bullies who think they can manipulate and control you." "But what if they find more ways to hurt us?" she whispered. "What if they start spreading rumors about you, about your business?" "Let them try," Alexander said, his voice fierce with protection. "I've built my reputation on integrity. The Prestons can't touch that." Miriam turned to face him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why are you willing to risk so much for me?" Alexander closed the distance between them, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Because you're worth it. Because what we have, it's become more than just an arrangement to me." Miriam leaned into his touch, letting out a shaky breath. "For me too," she admitted. "I'm just scared of losing it all again." "You won't," Alexander promised. "Whatever happens with the Prestons, whatever they throw at us, we'll face it together." They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, until Miriam's phone buzzed with an email notification. Her hands trembled as she read it. "They're claiming they have letters," she said, her voice breaking. "Personal letters that paint me in a terrible light. They're threatening to make them public if I don't drop my claim to the estate." Alexander's expression hardened. "Blackmail now? They're showing their true colors." Miriam sank into a chair, overwhelmed. I can't handle everyone knowing." "Hey!" Alexander knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Look at me. Whatever those letters say, whatever lies they've fabricated, it doesn't change who you are. You're strong, Miriam, stronger than they know." "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "Then lean on me," he said simply. "Let me be strong for both of us until you find your strength again." In that moment, looking into his eyes, Miriam saw something she'd been too afraid to acknowledge before. Love. Not the practical, business-like affection they'd started with, but something deeper, something that had grown naturally despite their best efforts to keep things simple. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "About James, about the last few months before he died." Alexander sat beside her, his presence steady and supportive as she shared the painful truth about her marriage's final days. How James had become increasingly unstable, how his family had covered up his problems, how she'd stayed out of fear and obligation rather than love. When she finished, Alexander pulled her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he murmured into her hair. "We'll get through this together, I promise." But the next morning brought more challenges. The Prestons' lawyer delivered a thick envelope filled with documents, bank statements, old photographs, and letters that had been carefully edited to paint Miriam as a gold digger who had married James for his money. Miriam's hands shook as she looked through the papers. "They've twisted everything," she said, her voice hollow. made innocent things look suspicious. Alexander studied the documents with a businessman's eye. "These have been manipulated," he said firmly. "We can prove that. But the damage will already be done," Miriam said, sinking into a chair. "Once people start talking, then we'll face it head on," Alexander said, kneeling beside her. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Miriam. You're not that scared woman anymore, letting them control your life with threats and lies." Miriam looked at him, seeing the fierce determination in his eyes. "You really aren't going to give up on me, are you?" "Never," he said simply, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "You're stuck with me now, for better or worse." Despite her fears, Miriam felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. This man, who had started as a business arrangement, had become her anchor in the storm. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth fighting for. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as Miriam sat at the kitchen table, staring at the thick manila envelope that had just arrived. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, knowing that whatever was inside couldn't be good news. Alexander stood behind her, his presence steady and reassuring as she slowly opened the envelope. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice breaking as she read the first page. They're trying to declare me an unfit heir. They're saying I was emotionally unstable after James died, and that I'm not capable of managing the estate." Alexander's jaw tightened as he looked over her shoulder at the legal documents. "This is a desperate move, Miriam. They're getting scared because they know we have a strong case." But Miriam could barely hear him over the rushing in her ears. The Prestons, her late husband's family, had attached sworn statements from family friends, old photographs taken during her darkest days of grief, and even medical records that had somehow been obtained. They had twisted her period of mourning into something sinister, painting her as mentally unstable and unfit to handle the substantial inheritance James had left her. "They've been planning this all along," she said, her voice hollow. "Watching me, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike." Alexander pulled up a chair beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Miriam. This is exactly what they want, to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel small and powerless. But you're not that person anymore." Tears welled up in Miriam's eyes. "Aren't I? Look at these pictures, Alexander. Look at what they're saying about me. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not strong enough for this fight." "That's not true," Alexander said firmly. "The woman I've come to know these past months is one of the strongest people I've ever met. You've survived so much already." But the pressure was mounting. Over the next few days, the Prestons escalated their attack. They filed emergency motions with the court, seeking temporary control of the estate. They sent private investigators to follow Miriam, documenting her every move. They even approached Alexander's business associates, trying to spread doubts about his judgment in defending her. Miriam felt the walls closing in. The emotional fortress she had carefully built over the past months began to crack. She started withdrawing, spending more time alone in her room, avoiding Alexander's concerned glances. One evening, after another difficult day of legal meetings, Alexander found her sitting in the dark on their bedroom balcony. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered as he approached. "I can't keep fighting them. They're too powerful, too determined. Maybe if I just give them what they want, they'll leave us alone." Alexander knelt beside her chair, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. "Miriam, look at me," he said gently but firmly. She turned to face him, and the love and determination in his eyes made her breath catch. "You are not alone in this fight," he said. "When I married you, I thought it was just a practical arrangement. But watching you these past months, your strength, your kindness, the way you've started to bloom despite everything they've thrown at you, it's changed everything. I believe in you, Miriam. I believe in us." His words penetrated the fog of fear and doubt that had been clouding her mind. "But what if we lose?" she asked softly. "Then we lose together," he replied. "But at least we'll know we fought for what's right. The Miriam I know doesn't let bullies win. Not anymore." She looked down at their intertwined hands, remembering how far she'd come from the frightened widow she'd been. "I'm so tired of being afraid," she admitted. "Then let's turn that fear into strength," Alexander said. "You have more power than you realize, Miriam. James left you the estate because he trusted you with it, despite what his family wanted. Don't let them steal that from you." As his words sank in, something shifted inside Miriam. The fear was still there, but alongside it grew a steady resolve. She thought of all the times the Prestons had manipulated her, had made her feel small and worthless. She thought of other women who might face similar battles, who needed to see that it was possible to stand up to wealth and power. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not that scared woman anymore. I won't let them bully me into submission." Alexander smiled, seeing the determination return to her eyes. "There's my fighter," he said softly. The next morning, Miriam called their lawyer herself, something she'd always let Alexander handle before. "I want to file a countersuit," she said firmly. "I want to expose every manipulative thing they've done, every lie they've told. No more hiding." As she hung up the phone, she caught Alexander watching her with pride in his eyes. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he replied with a smile. "I just love seeing you stand up for yourself. It looks good on you." Miriam felt a warm blush creep across her cheeks. This man, who had started as a business arrangement, had become her strongest ally and supporter. His faith in her had helped her find faith in herself. Together, they began gathering their own evidence, documentation of the Prestons' harassment, witness statements about their manipulation tactics, proof of their attempts to interfere with Alexander's business relationships. With each piece of evidence they collected, Miriam's confidence grew stronger. "They thought they could break me," she said one evening as they reviewed their case files. "They thought I would crumble under pressure like I used to, but they didn't count on one thing." "What's that?" Alexander asked. Miriam reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "They didn't count on me having someone who believes in me, who shows me every day that I'm stronger than I think I am." Alexander brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You always had that strength, Miriam. I just helped you remember it." As they prepared for the upcoming court battle, Miriam felt a profound shift in her spirit. The fear wasn't gone completely. Perhaps it never would be. But it no longer controlled her. She had found her voice, her courage, and most importantly, a partner who stood beside her, not because of duty or arrangement, but because he truly believed in her. The Prestons had tried to break her spirit, but instead they had forced her to find her strength. With Alexander by her side, she was ready to fight not just for her inheritance, but for her dignity and her future. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of their home office as Miriam sat at her desk, reviewing the legal documents spread before her. Her hands, once trembling when handling anything related to her late husband's family, now moved with purpose across the papers. Alexander stood nearby, his presence a steady anchor in the storm they were weathering together. "I've found something," Miriam said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. She held up a document, her eyes bright with determination. "These financial records show how they've been trying to manipulate the estate's assets even before James passed away." Alexander moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is exactly what we need, Miriam. You're doing incredible work." The warmth of his touch sent strength through her body. It amazed her how different this touch felt compared to the fearful years she'd endured before. Where James's family had used touch to intimidate and control, Alexander's touch always carried support and encouragement. "I spent so many years being afraid of them," Miriam admitted, looking up at her husband. "They made me believe I was nothing without their approval. But now—" She straightened her shoulders. "Now I see them for what they really are. Bullies who use their money and influence to control others." Alexander pulled up a chair beside her. "And bullies always back down when someone stands up to them. We have truth on our side, Miriam. That's more powerful than all their money and connections." They worked together through the morning, building their case piece by piece. Miriam's knowledge of the family's history combined with Alexander's business acumen created a formidable defense against their attacks. As they worked, Miriam felt her confidence growing stronger with each passing hour. During their lunch break, Alexander watched his wife with quiet admiration. The woman before him was so different from the veiled widow he'd married. Her eyes sparkled with purpose, her movements were sure and determined, and her voice carried a strength that came from deep within. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Miriam said softly, setting down her sandwich. "Strong, capable. When James died, his family convinced me I was too weak to handle anything on my own. I believed them for so long." Alexander reached across the table and took her hand. "They were wrong about you. They've always been wrong about you." A small smile played at the corners of Miriam's mouth. "You know what's funny? I used to think our marriage was just going to be a business arrangement, a way to feel safe. But you've given me so much more than safety, Alexander. You've helped me find myself again." Alexander's eyes softened, and Miriam could see the emotion he usually kept hidden behind his businesslike exterior. "You've given me something too," he admitted. "I thought I was done with real connections after my first marriage ended. I built walls so high, I forgot what it felt like to truly care about someone. But watching you fight, seeing your courage, it's taught me that being vulnerable isn't always a weakness." Later that afternoon, their lawyer called with news that the Prestons had filed additional motions to try and force Miriam to relinquish her claims to the estate. Instead of crumbling under the pressure as she might have done months ago, Miriam's response was immediate and firm. "Tell them we're not backing down," she said into the phone, her voice steady and clear. "In fact, we're ready to counter with everything we've uncovered about their manipulation tactics." After hanging up, she turned to Alexander, who was watching her with pride. "You know they're going to fight dirty," he warned gently. Miriam nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Let them try. I'm not that scared woman anymore. They can't hurt me now." As if to test her resolve, the next day brought a series of threatening letters from the Prestons' lawyers, followed by calls from family friends trying to pressure her into backing down. But with each attempt to intimidate her, Miriam's resolve only grew stronger. She spent hours organizing evidence, making calls to potential witnesses, and working with their legal team. Alexander watched in amazement as she transformed from a victim of their manipulation into a powerful advocate for her own rights. One evening, as they prepared for their upcoming court date, Alexander found Miriam standing in front of their bedroom mirror, studying her reflection. The fear that had once clouded her eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. "What do you see?" he asked, coming to stand behind her. "I see someone who's finally ready to fight for what's right," she answered, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Someone who's not afraid anymore." Alexander wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "I see someone who's always been strong, even when she didn't know it. Someone who's teaching me every day what real courage looks like." Miriam leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. "We're going to win this fight." she said with quiet certainty. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been bullied or manipulated by people with power and money. Yes, we are. Alexander agreed, his voice firm with conviction. Together. As they prepared for bed that night, Miriam reflected on how far they'd both come. She had transformed from a grieving widow into a woman who knew her own worth, while Alexander had learned to open his heart again after years of keeping it locked away. Their marriage, which had started as a practical arrangement, had become a partnership built on trust, respect, and deep emotional connection. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more attempts by the Prestons to break her spirit. But Miriam knew she could face anything with Alexander by her side. She was no longer fighting just to keep her inheritance. She was fighting to protect the beautiful life and love she had found with Alexander, a love that had helped her rediscover her own strength and worth. As they lay in bed that night, Miriam curled into Alexander's embrace, feeling safe and strong. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had transformed into determination. Together, they had built something the Prestons could never take away, a partnership based on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine love. The morning of the final court hearing dawned bright and clear. Miriam stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her navy blue blazer with steady hands. Gone was the trembling woman who had once hidden behind veils of grief. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had finally found her voice. Alexander appeared behind her, his reflection showing the same quiet confidence that she felt. "Ready?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "More than ready," Miriam replied, covering his hand with her own. "Whatever happens today, I know who I am now. That's something they can't take away from me." The courthouse bustled with activity as they made their way through security. Miriam's late husband's family, the Prestons, were already seated in the courtroom, their faces twisted with barely concealed contempt. But where their cold stares had once made her shrink into herself, Miriam now held her head high. Their lawyer, Sarah Chen, met them at the door with a reassuring smile. "Everything's in order," she whispered. "The judge has reviewed all the evidence of their manipulation tactics. We're in a strong position." The proceedings began with the usual formalities. As Miriam listened to both sides present their final arguments, she found herself thinking about how much had changed. 6 months ago, she would have given anything to avoid this confrontation. Now she sat straight-backed and determined, ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. The Preston family lawyer painted her as an opportunist, someone who had married into their family and was now trying to claim more than she deserved. But when it was Sarah's turn to speak, she presented a different story, one backed by years of documented abuse, manipulation, and attempts to control Miriam's life even after her husband's death. "Your Honor," Sarah concluded, "Mrs. Montgomery isn't just fighting for material possessions. She's fighting for her right to exist as an independent person, free from the controlling influence of a family that has never accepted her as one of their own." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the tension like a knife. "Having reviewed all the evidence presented, I find in favor of Mrs. Montgomery. The estate shall remain under her control, as per her late husband's will. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order against the Preston family, prohibiting them from any further attempts to harass or intimidate Mrs. Montgomery." The victory felt surreal. Miriam sat perfectly still as the words washed over her, barely registering the sound of angry mutters from the Preston family or Alexander's warm hand squeezing hers. It was over. After years of fighting, it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, standing in the warm afternoon sun, Miriam felt lighter than she had in years. Alexander pulled her into a tight embrace, and she could feel the pride radiating from him. "You did it," he whispered into her. "Hair, We did it. She corrected him, pulling back to meet his eyes. I couldn't have done this without you. That evening, they decided to celebrate quietly at home rather than going out. Miriam kicked off her heels and curled up on their living room couch, while Alexander opened a bottle of champagne. The simple domesticity of the moment struck her. How natural it felt to be here with him. How far they'd come from their awkward beginning as practical strangers in an arranged marriage. You know what's funny? Miriam said as Alexander handed her a glass. When this all started, I thought the inheritance was everything. I was so afraid of losing it because it felt like the only thing I had left of my old life. But now... She paused, taking a thoughtful sip. Now I realize it's just money. What really matters is what I've found along the way. Alexander settled beside her on the couch, his expression thoughtful. I used to think the same way about my company, he admitted. I thought success meant having the biggest deals, the most impressive portfolio. It took meeting you to make me realize how empty that kind of success can be without someone to share it with. Miriam leaned against him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. We were both so broken when we met. She mused. Me with my grief, you with your walls. Who would have thought we'd end up healing each other? I remember thinking you were going to be a burden, Alexander said with a self-deprecating laugh. This sad widow I'd have to take care of. Instead, you turned out to be the strongest person I've ever met. The evening stretched on peacefully as they talked, sharing memories of their journey together. Miriam spoke about her fears during the early days of their marriage, how she'd been afraid to let anyone close after what she'd been through with her first husband. Alexander opened up about his own struggles with trust, how watching Miriam fight for herself had inspired him to face his own emotional barriers. As the sun set, casting long shadows across their living room, Miriam felt a profound sense of contentment. The inheritance that had once seemed so crucial now felt almost secondary to what she'd gained in personal growth and love. She had found her voice, her strength, and most importantly, a partner who supported her completely. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, noticing her contemplative expression. I'm thinking about how sometimes the things we think we want aren't really what we need. She replied. I thought I needed that inheritance to feel secure, to feel like I had worth. But what I really needed was to find my own strength, to learn that I had value beyond what anyone else could give me or take away. Alexander nodded, understanding in his eyes. And I thought I needed to keep everyone at arm's length to protect myself. Turns out what I really needed was to let someone in. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. The legal battle was over, but Miriam knew this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. She and Alexander had found something rare and precious, a love built on mutual respect, understanding, and growth. The inheritance that had caused so much strife was just money in the end. The real treasure was what they'd built together, a partnership that had helped them both become stronger, better versions of themselves. As Miriam curled closer into Alexander's embrace, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, not just to victory in court, but to this quiet moment of shared understanding and love. The morning sun painted golden streaks across their bedroom as Miriam and Alexander packed their bags for their weekend getaway. It had been Alexander's idea, a chance to escape the city, to breathe fresh air and reconnect away from the memories of courtrooms and family disputes. Are you sure this little cabin of yours is actually habitable? Miriam teased, folding a warm sweater into her overnight bag. I remember what you said about it being rustic. Alexander's eyes crinkled with amusement. It's perfectly fine. My grandfather built it himself, and I've kept it maintained. Besides," he added, zipping up his own bag, "I thought you were the one who taught me to appreciate the simple things in life." The drive took them 3 hours north, winding through roads that grew progressively narrower and more remote. Tall pines flanked their path, their branches swaying gently in the autumn breeze. Miriam watched the scenery change through the passenger window, feeling the weight of the past few months slowly lifting from her shoulders. When they finally arrived, the cabin surprised her. It was small but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and large windows that seemed to invite the forest inside. A nearby stream provided a constant, soothing backdrop of rushing water. "This is beautiful," Miriam breathed, stepping onto the porch. "Why haven't you brought me here before?" Alexander set their bags down and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I guess I was waiting for the right time. After everything we've been through, it felt like we needed this." They spent the afternoon settling in, with Alexander showing her around the property. The interior was cozy, with warm wood panels and comfortable, well-worn furniture. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and Alexander soon had a fire crackling, chasing away the autumn chill. As evening approached, they sat together on the porch swing, watching the sun set through the trees. Miriam had made them hot chocolate, and the sweet aroma mingled with the crisp forest air. "I used to come here when things got overwhelming," Alexander said, breaking their comfortable silence. "After my divorce, I spent weeks here, trying to make sense of everything that had happened." Miriam turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "What happened? You've never really told me the whole story." Alexander took a deep breath. "I thought I had it all figured out. The perfect marriage, the perfect life. But she was only interested in what my success could give her. When she left, she took half of everything I'd built, but what hurt most was realizing that none of it had been real. That's why I built those walls you first encountered. I couldn't bear the thought of being that wrong about someone again." Miriam reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I understand that fear," she said softly. "With my late husband, it was different, but similar in some ways. He didn't want my money. He wanted control. Every day he would chip away at my confidence, my sense of self. By the end, I barely recognized myself in the mirror." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with shared pain, but also understanding. Alexander squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "The worst part," Miriam went on, her voice barely above a whisper, "was that I believed him. When he told me I was worthless, that no one else would ever want me, I believed it. Even after he was gone, those words stayed with me, like poison in my mind." Alexander pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "But you proved him wrong," he said firmly. "You fought for yourself, for what was rightfully yours. You showed everyone, including me, just how strong you are." The next morning, they hiked along the stream, following a trail that Alexander knew from his childhood. The forest was alive with autumn colors, brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow in the morning light. They stopped at a small clearing where a fallen log provided a natural bench. "I need to tell you something," Miriam said, sitting down beside him. "When we first got married, I was terrified, not just because of my past, but because I was afraid I'd never be able to love again. I thought my heart was too broken, too scarred." Alexander listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. "But being with you," she continued, "watching you gradually let down your own walls, seeing how you supported me even when I pushed you away, it helped me believe in love again. Not the fairy tale kind, but something real and honest. I never expected this," Alexander admitted, gesturing between them. "When I proposed our arrangement, I thought it would be simple, clean. Just two people helping each other through life. I never imagined I'd find someone who would make me want to be vulnerable again. They spent the rest of the day exploring the wilderness around the cabin, sharing more stories from their pasts. Not just the painful ones, but happy memories too. Miriam told him about her childhood dreams of becoming a dancer, and Alexander shared amusing stories about his early business ventures, including a spectacularly failed attempt at selling homemade jewelry in college. As night fell, they sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a soft blanket. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the sound of the stream outside provided a gentle melody to their conversation. "You know what I've realized," Miriam said, watching the fire. "All this time, we were both so afraid of being hurt again that we almost missed out on something beautiful. It's like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to go wrong." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now I'm not afraid anymore," she said with quiet certainty. "Whatever comes our way, I know we'll face it together. Not because we have to, but because we want to." In that moment, surrounded by the peaceful solitude of the forest and the warmth of their shared understanding, both Miriam and Alexander felt something shift. The walls they had built to protect themselves had crumbled completely, replaced by a foundation of trust and genuine love that felt unshakable. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but it had evolved into something far more precious, a partnership built on mutual healing, growth, and profound understanding. As they sat together in the firelight, they knew their bond had become something neither of them could have imagined when they first said, "I do." The trauma of their pasts would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a deeper connection, one forged through vulnerability, patience, and unwavering support. The drive home from their retreat felt different somehow. The familiar roads seemed brighter, more welcoming, as Miriam and Alexander's car wound its way back to their house. Their hands remained intertwined on the center console, neither wanting to break the connection they'd strengthened during their time away. "I was thinking," Alexander said, glancing at Miriam with a warm smile, "maybe we could renovate the garden room into a dance studio for you." Miriam's eyes widened. "You remembered?" "Of course I did. Every dream you've shared matters to me." Back home, they spent the evening planning their future together. Alexander sketched out ideas for the dance studio, while Miriam talked about teaching dance to local children. Their conversation flowed easily, filled with hopes and dreams that now seemed within reach. But later that night, as Miriam stood in their bathroom getting ready for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The old doubts crept in, unwanted and overwhelming. Her hands began to shake as she gripped the counter. "Am I really worthy of all this?" she whispered to herself. "What if I'm still too broken?" Alexander found her there, tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Listen to me," he said firmly but gently. "Our love isn't about being worthy or perfect. It's about growing together, healing together. I'm in this for the long haul, Miriam, however long it takes." She turned in his arms, burying her face in his chest. "But what if I never fully heal?" "Then we'll keep working on it together," he replied, stroking her hair. "Your scars are part of who you are, and I love all of you." In that moment, something settled in Miriam's heart. The doubts didn't vanish completely, but they lost their sharp edges. She realized that true love wasn't about being completely healed. It was about finding someone who would walk beside you through the healing process. "I love you," she whispered, and for the first time, the words felt completely free of fear or reservation. Alexander's arms tightened around her. "I love you too, all of you, always." Standing there in their bathroom, Miriam finally allowed herself to fully embrace the love they'd found together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and strong and true. And that was more than enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Miriam and Alexander sat at their breakfast table, hands clasped together. The decision they'd made the night before still felt fresh and exciting. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Miriam asked, her eyes searching his face. Alexander squeezed her hand. "Building our family together? I've never been more certain of anything." They spent their weekends volunteering at the local community center, teaching dance and business skills to underprivileged youth. Miriam watched with pride as Alexander patiently helped teenagers create their first business plans, his genuine care for their success evident in every interaction. One Tuesday evening, while helping at the food bank, Miriam's son tugged on Alexander's sleeve. The boy's eyes were serious, filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "Mommy says you're my daddy," he said simply, his small hand reaching for Alexander's. Alexander felt his heart swell with emotion. Kneeling down to the boy's level, he pulled him into a gentle hug. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The emptiness he'd carried for so long disappeared, replaced by the warmth of complete belonging. "Yes," Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am your daddy." He held his son close, feeling the profound weight of those words settle into his heart. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly whole. Later that evening, Miriam and Alexander sat on their back porch, watching their son play in the yard. The setting sun painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, casting a gentle glow over their home. Their fingers were intertwined, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about their journey together. "Look at him," Miriam said softly, her eyes following their son as he chased butterflies. "He's so happy. We all are." Alexander pulled her closer, remembering how far they'd come from their first meeting. The business arrangement that had started their story felt like a lifetime ago. Now their love flowed naturally, built on trust, understanding, and shared experiences. "We've built something beautiful here," Alexander said, his voice filled with warmth. "Something real?" Miriam nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. Who would have thought that two broken people could find such wholeness together? Their son ran up to them, his face beaming with joy. "Daddy, Mummy, look what I found!" He held up a small dandelion, its white seeds ready to scatter in the wind. "Make a wish," Miriam encouraged, her eyes meeting Alexander's with understanding. Together they watched as their son closed his eyes tight and blew the seeds into the air. The tiny white parachutes danced in the breeze, carrying wishes and dreams into the future, a future they would face together, as a family. "I love you both so much," Alexander said, pulling them both into an embrace. Standing there, united in love and hope, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their story had transformed from one of loss and hesitation into one of healing and joy, proving that love could indeed conquer all wounds and create something beautiful from broken pieces. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.